Welcome to the Nebraska Cattlemen's Cattle Edge Producer Education webinar. I am Benita Lettier, Director of Producer Education with the Nebraska Cattlemen. We are very excited to be hosting another Cattle Edge webinar, and tonight our partner is Esg Agri-Services and Engineering. Nebraska Cattlemen works for cattlemen on the issues affecting them. Some of the areas you'll find us working is legislative and regulatory affairs, and producer education programs. If you want to know what the Nebraska Cattlemen are doing, please check out our website. Members receive a newsletter every other week, so if you're not receiving that, please let us know. You'll also find us on several social medias, including Facebook and Twitter. If you are not a Nebraska Cattlemen member, we hope that you will consider investing in our organization. Before we get started tonight, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have a question for our speaker, Dean, during the presentation, you can type your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Dean will be watching for questions, and we'll get to those questions either during one of our breaks or at the end of the webinar. Dean's presentation tonight has 3 sections, and between each of the sections, he will be answering questions. At this time, if you want to write your question in the Q&A box, you can use that. Or if you'd like to raise your hand and ask your question live, we'll use that process. I'll let you know when I unmute you so you know that you can speak. And if we want to give it a test, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that raise hand. If you guys all want to give it a try and see if it works. Perfect. Perfect. So we'll use that for questions during the breaks between Dean's sections. If you have any problems during the webinar, you can always text me. My number is 402-450-0223. We will be recording the webinar, and it will be posted on our website in the morning. You can also find our webinars where you download your favorite podcast. So at this time, I want to thank Dean for taking his time this evening to spend with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Dean.
Thank you very much, Benita. I very much appreciate the opportunity to visit with everyone tonight. Again, we're going to talk about your livestock operation and as well as your farming and grazing operations that may attach to that. And what does a carbon footprint really mean to those operations, and try to dig into that question just a little bit more. How do we measure it is one part, and of course, why it matters is probably the more important part of it. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a Nebraska native and been a cattle producer my entire life. And in 1997, I left Nebraska Cattlemen's Organization as the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs, which I enjoyed immensely, and started up Esg Agri-Services and Engineering. And so this will be we're in our 24th year of business right now, and we'll have our 25th year of business here next April. So we're very excited about that, and we're pleased to be here. So we're going to divide this meeting up into 3 categories. What is a carbon footprint? And we're going to dive into that just a little bit. What is methane digestion? And what does that really mean to a carbon footprint, and how can that benefit the livestock industry long term? And then we'll get into how do we try to monetize these opportunities long term. And we all know that profitability is what matters in our operation day to day as much as anything in terms of creating financial stability. So if there's not a way to monetize it, it becomes a threat. And if we can monetize it, it becomes an opportunity, and we're going to talk specifically about that. So I'm going to start out talking just a little bit about sustainability and what does that really mean. The word is very, very complex in a lot of respects, but overall, it just means that we're sustainable. We can be here for a long time doing what we're doing. And so we look at the different portions of sustainability, and we'll talk more about that later. But it's very important that we understand what that word really means and how it applies to our operations. We know without question it's becoming increasingly important as we move down the road in terms of hearing the news and what our industry information is telling us, and we hear that word constantly. It gets overused and it becomes somewhat abused, but nonetheless, it is important. We need to make sure we understand what that means. Without question, our government and even our supply chains have taken notice of that word, and we're trying to figure out how does that really apply. And bottom line, it is a growing trend in our industry, and we need to figure out how to take advantage of that, understand it, and possibly even monetize it long term. When we look at the trends, we know that many of the world's largest investors have really put a big, strong focus on trying to figure out what is carbon reduction and carbon neutrality. It is a very high priority for most all of them at this point. Many of the globe's leading manufacturers have done exactly the same. And so we look at that and we try to figure out what does that mean to those of us that are in a supply chain, whether it's in the cattle business or any other business right now. Everybody wants to be quote unquote carbon neutral. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. Do you believe in climate change or not? That's a question of the day. And irregardless of our belief there are huge efforts all across the globe of trying to figure out how to achieve carbon neutrality. And so we got to figure out how we move forward with those types of things. We also know that Cargill, JBS, and Tyson have all been pushing very, very hard for this carbon neutrality. JBS, the most aggressive. By 2030, they want to be carbon neutral in their entire supply chain. Cargill and Tyson are looking at, by 2040 for JBS. And Cargill and Tyson are both looking at similar goals, but maybe not quite as aggressive. What does that mean for us in the livestock industry? Can we indeed achieve that? So those are the things that we got to look at and figure out what that really means to us. And of course, this last year at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association meeting, they too adopted a goal of being carbon neutral by 2040 for the entire industry. So quite honestly, those are aggressive goals. And when we look at what's happened in the past 5 or 10 years in the California market, for example, there are a lot of companies struggling to figure out how they're going to get there without purchasing those credits. And we'll get into what that means shortly. But nonetheless, they are aggressive goals, and we need to figure out, is that something that we can be a part of? Can we monetize that? If so, then it's probably going to be something that we need to look at pretty strong. Why does it really matter? And I've asked myself this question 100 times, trying to figure out what this really means. The bottom line is the consumers are still writing our paycheck, and we need to figure out what that consumer is saying. Right, wrong, or indifferent, we can educate that consumer, we can change their minds without question. But bottom line is we still need to remember they are writing our paycheck every time that we produce beef or whatever commodity it is that we're producing. And we're seeing a clear signal coming back from packers at this point that we need to pay attention to these things. It's likely there will be new rules or hopefully incentives coming down the pipe. Two different segments there. The new rules always scare everybody, and myself included. But will there be incentives from the supply chain that make those things more livable or even voluntary? That would be the best bet. We know that we want to be ahead of that trend, and so we got to pull our head out of the sand and take a look at it. It's something that we just can't look away from at this point in time. If we lead that way, we're obviously going to be in better shape long term, not only from a sustainability standpoint, but again, from a profitability standpoint, because that is the bottom line of what really matters. One thing that we do know that producers, are the next link in that supply chain conversation. That's happening today, and it's happening at a very fast rate of speed. Doesn't matter what industry you're in, whether it's agriculture or livestock specifically, or any other value chain that's created. We also know that there's a lot of value that can be created. When we look at carbon credits, how do we capture it? How do we sell it? What does that really mean? And then we'll talk specifically about methane capture and how do we monetize those types of things. What is in it for our industry? What are our challenges? Many opportunities to get involved with this when we look at crops, range, timber credits, and then of course the methane side of the equation. So overall, there's a lot of different segments that we really need to take a look at here. So when we talk about carbon footprint determination, what does that really mean? And a carbon footprint is really defined as the total greenhouse gases, or GHGs, emissions that are caused by any individual or an organization, a service, a place, or a product being generated. And so when we try to boil that down, it really matters of where do we put the parameters or the fences on that particular event or particular organization that we're trying to analyze and figure out what is their carbon footprint. That can go very, very broad, and it can go very narrow, and we'll try to define that for you as we move along through this presentation. Bottom line is greenhouse gases are really a primary component of 3 different gases plus a few others, but mostly carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide, we know, is fairly potent. It has a problem with causing problems with the ozone, and it does hold heat. There's no question about that. I think that science has been documented. The problem with carbon is it lasts a very long time. Methane, on the other hand, is 25 more times potent as CO2 and trapping heat in the atmosphere. The good news is that methane breaks down a lot quicker and really has an indefinite life cycle or a definite life cycle, and it keeps repeating itself. So total methane production really doesn't change over time. That's the good news. Carbon, every time we create more carbon into the atmosphere, it does stay there for a very long period of time. So the methane may be more potent, doesn't last near as long. Carbon dioxide, much more of an issue long-term. Methane and nitrous oxide both have what we call an equivalency ratio that basically puts them on an equal number, if you will, an equal value to carbon. And that allows us to make comparisons between carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And that'll mean more in just a minute, but keep that in mind that there's an equivalency factor that plays into how those things are used. So when we look at a carbon footprint, really all we're doing is assessing the value of carbon or those equivalents of what that output is of a facility at all levels, and trying to use industry standards. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But industry standards are very, very important. Otherwise, we really don't have a good way of evaluating something that creates a baseline that means anything long-term, not only within our industry, but against other industries. Emissions are usually assessed from scopes 1 to 3. Those scopes are very well defined, and it's a way of categorizing the different sources of greenhouse gases that are emitted from a facility or an organization or a factory or whatever it is that we're evaluating. Standardization, again, is the key. Otherwise, without that, we really have no way of comparing, and it doesn't mean anything when we get to looking at what is its true value at the end of this process. When we look at those scopes, to really boil it down as simple as we can, a scope 1 is really direct emissions. What happens day to day in that operation? We need to feed the cattle. There's probably a truck running at that point in time. We need to load the feed wagon. There's a loader running. There's always pickups and other service vehicles that are running around doing the same thing. And so those are really considered direct emissions without getting into the gory details. So keep that in mind. Scope 1, direct emissions. Scope 2 are indirect emissions. They typically are going to be from your office electricity, from feed mills or anything that's going on, from a center pivot that's running, anything that's really a direct impact to that operation that is more or less going to be needed day to day to make that operation run. They call it indirect, but I kind of look at it more as a direct impact because of the nature of the beast, and it's needed to service what happens in scope number 1. And then scope number 3 is indirect. And this is the most intangible and the one that really takes the most effort in really determining how do we look at everything that's going on in the supply chain? How do we look at the employee vehicles and what's happening? And so those things are really more indirect and are a result of our activities in 1 and 2. So again, this is kind of a summary of what we just talked about, but I want to be specific about this because it's very important. A scope 1 is, again, direct. So any fuel combustion that's going on, any vehicles that are running and operating, things of that nature. Scope 2 is going to be, again, any purchased electricity or energies that are used in that daily operation of the facility. And then 3 really gets into that one that, again, gets very ambiguous and sometimes hard to define. What happens with our employees as they come to and from work? That goes against your carbon footprint. If I travel for business, that goes against your carbon footprint. Supply chain procurement and transportation. What are we bringing into that facility? So we have to stop that and start that somewhere. The question always comes up as to if a truckload of corn is coming to my facility, is that part of my footprint? And if a load of market cattle are leaving my facility, is that part of my footprint? And typically you got to start and stop those things at a certain point in time. And that's what this process is designed to do. Other items that go under this is purchase seed, fertilizers, herbicide, insecticide. All of those have a footprint that you're inheriting when you purchase them. So how does that affect your net carbon number as this thing moves down the road? And then, of course, the process of products being sold, and this one can be very tricky, as we just discussed. And it needs to be looked at that it doesn't double up. So if we look at our operation and what it has, and we actually account for the cattle leaving the facility and affecting and contributing to our carbon index number, what about the packer that's buying them? And it's also on their number? Well, that doesn't make sense. It's either got to be one or the other. And so those are the things that we look at when we try to analyze this a little bit further. In summary on greenhouse gases, really it's just clearly about what amount of CO2 or the equivalents of methane, nitrous oxide are being emitted on an annual basis. And again, this is scored out on a 1-year basis. A calendar year is always the best, or whatever your particular tax year might begin and end, because a lot of things that we're going to be looking at are the amount of energies purchased and products purchased and things of that nature. So it makes it a little bit simpler to calculate if we follow that. Again, it breaks it down into these industry standards. These standards are not just involving the livestock industry. They are standards that have been developed for every single industry across the planet. And it's really a worldwide industry standard at this point in time. And then trying to add those 2 or 3 up and figure out what is our cumulative number that establishes the baseline of those greenhouse gas emissions. Compare your operation in the industry to others, or compare your operation to other industries. It gives us the ability to do that. Where are we at today? Are we causing problems? Are we not causing problems, regardless if we think it's a problem? And then how do we actually make decisions on what we should do different? Can we create change if it does not have a substantial cost? Kind of makes sense. Can we get paid for what we're doing if we are indeed able to solve some of those problems long term? So again, going back to how do we monetize those types of scenarios and practices and getting paid for it? Obviously, what we provide to our buyers of our product, hopefully will turn into an incentive. If we're shipping a load of fat cattle to JBS at some point, will we get paid for an incentive? I don't know that, but one would hope that there will be different incentives for different practices that do show what that carbon footprint number is on any given time and point. I'm going to give you an example of how this is being monetized as we speak. So this is a company called Gevo, and they are basically an ethanol company that has turned and really reformulated their processes of creating ethanol to create jet fuel, diesel fuel, and things of that nature that have a 0 carbon footprint number. And so that is the whole goal of what they're trying to produce. And it's really an interesting one, because I'll get to that in a point of how they've really turned this into a process of being able to monetize it and give people value for what it is that they're asking for. But this company has really been set up to maximize the value of those renewable energy sources, something that we haven't seen in many others at this point in time. They're truly putting their money where their mouth is. So when we look at this and we try to figure out what does this really mean, we know, for example, that anytime we look at a production cycle, there's got to be a cycle, otherwise it's not sustainable. What do we do with the manure? We turn it into methane, we turn that into biogas, we turn that into energy, on and on. And we can look through those different charts all day long and get confused. But bottom line is they do make sense, and they all have a cyclical effect to them. If they don't, they're probably not going to be sustainable, and we need to remember that. But their number one goal is how do we create a renewable natural product and replace fossil greenhouse gas emissions, fossil derived greenhouse gas emissions over time. And what they're doing and how they're doing that is really pretty simple. They're going to figure out a way to create that product on a 0 footprint and be able to move that forward and monetize it. The first thing they're doing is creating aviation fuel. Aviation fuel is something that has a huge carbon footprint to it, as we all know, but they are actually going to be able to sell aviation fuel that has a carbon index of 0. It's got some other properties that are cool. We don't need to get into those, but bottom line is it's a product that can be substituted immediately for jet fuel and provide a carbon footprint that's neutral, something that's really never been done before. So this company has basically set out to say, you know what, we can do that. We think we can make that work. And they are putting up a plant in South Dakota starting next year to do exactly that. They'll be purchasing about 30 million bushels of corn. Really, the process isn't any different than what we've seen in our ethanol production systems. Other than the product going in will have a carbon index number associated with it because they are going to do the verification, excuse me, and documentation that's needed to understand what that corn feedstock source is coming from. What are their values when they come to them, and they're going to get paid for that. At the same time, when that product goes out, we know that it's going to have a carbon neutral number associated with it. It does provide for opportunity for people that are feeding cattle that want to do exactly the same. So you start looking at those things, it kind of does make some sense, at least from an economic standpoint. And we know there's probably going to be monetary value associated with that the way it looks. So we look at that and say, yeah, can it be monetized? It definitely will, even at the corn farm, operations level. One of the things that we've been starting to do is conduct these carbon footprint processes and inventories, and then trying to apply the analytics on facilities at this point in time. It takes about 3 months to complete. It essentially evaluates the entire operation. If there's just a feedlot, that's what gets evaluated. If it has farming associated with it and it's controlled and owned, then that gets evaluated with it as well. And then we look at ranching, same thing. What we're learning is that a feedlot may have a positive number, farming may have close to a neutral number, and ranching can even have a neutral to a negative number. And most of those practices that are occurring, no-till farming and things of that nature, can really lead and add to those negative values, which in turn can net out any positive numbers that are coming from a feedlot. The good news about that is overall, it probably doesn't look all that bad for our industry when we start looking at it and evaluate it on a facility by facility basis. We're going to know a lot more on that within the next year, but it does give us a really good way of understanding what is the effect of your operation today as it's relating to a carbon footprint, and understanding, does that really mean anything to you at this point in time? So it's an interesting process, and one that we're trying to kick off as we speak. And so the introduction and kickoff meeting is really the first step. We then go into weekly meetings to gather the data. That part's a little bit cumbersome. And then once we collect the data on all those different things that we mentioned, we go into an analytics phase. And the analytics phase really follows a group of standards. And that standardization is extremely important. If we don't follow a standard, it really has no value whatsoever back to the rest of the country or any other industry for that matter. Those standards, we won't get into all of them today, but are really worldwide and nationwide standards that do allow some type of consistency, from evaluator to evaluator, if you will. Once we get that accomplished, we put together what we call a report of findings. And that gives us an inventory of all greenhouse gases by scope. What is the methodology by scope that was used to get to that point? We also then look at what data source and emission factors are contributing to that. And that leads us to our assessment, if you will, of hotspots. What problems are there in the operation that we can have a meaningful impact to? What problems are there that maybe we can't do anything about, but at least at that point in time, we know. And so it does give us the ability to really get analytical about it and say, yeah, we're doing a pretty good job, or no, maybe there's a few things that we could do different here to make it one step better. So with that, I'm going to shift gears and we're going to switch over to another discussion. But if there are any questions that come up, that type of a thing. Bonita, I'm not seeing a question screen on here at chat screen. Why am I not seeing that?
So down at the bottom, there's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And I don't have any questions. So if anybody has
Yeah,
a question
perfect.
that they would like to answer or ask the question, please raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or you can type in that Q&A box. If not, we'll move on to the next section here.
Very good. I'll just keep motoring along, but if any questions come up, we'll just answer them as we go. So I want to take a brief moment and talk a little bit about what does this really mean in terms of trying to evaluate your operation against everybody else's. One step, as we just talked about, was determining what is that carbon footprint. The next step is really what we call an ESG framework or an ESG evaluation. ESG looks at three things: environment, your social, and your governance side of the equation, and tries to figure out how do you rank in those categories, because this is basically a across the industry wide accepted practice to figure out what is your sustainability. And it kind of makes sense after you get into it. A sustainability assessment really goes in to determining what are those three things doing in your operation. And then those ratings are really defined as very narrow, quantifiable metrics that can predict future growth and profitability. When the first time I looked at this, I was a little skeptical as that it maybe had a whole lot of value to our industry. But then we started realizing that many other industries are using it, and they're using it in a way that not only verifies to maybe their stockholders or shareholders, but to family members or whatever the case may be, that, yeah, we are doing everything that we can when it comes to those three things. And it's something that we just don't want to overlook, but it does give us another method to look at and find out what is the sustainability of our operation when it comes down to comparing ourselves to others and figuring out if we have problems. The best part of it, it does create what we call a gap analysis. That gap analysis is used to figure out where our problems are and how do we go about trying to fix those problems. The first thing we really do in a gathering process, if you will, our ESG assessment is we go into the gathering process of gathering that information. We want to look at existing practices that are used in that operation. What are they doing from an environmental standpoint? What are they doing from a social standpoint? How do they respond to their community? How do they give back to their community? Things of that nature. And then, of course, governance. How do they respond to family members, shareholders, and those types of things, and making sure that there aren't problems with any of those three. Those three usually define what kind of operation that you're dealing with. They also look at buyer specific requirements, if you will. And again, then the next step is really to figure out, again, where are those problems? And then how do we assess those to make sure that we're not causing a problem long-term? And at the same time, we know that we are quote unquote sustainable, maybe compared to our counterparts that are out there. It's a little bit more ambiguous, but it does make a lot of sense. And it's something that the industry has not used. And I think that's probably gonna change a little bit more as we go. Bottom line, it does one thing. It gives us a comparative understanding of what our operation does and acts like from a sustainability standpoint. And again, they're based on standards that are not only international, but national as well. We're going to shift gears one more time, and this one's going to get a little bit more interesting and quite honestly is a lot of fun to discuss, because I think there's huge potential for the livestock industry here. And we're seeing those things already being taken advantage of in other counterparts of our livestock industry. So really, methane digestion and how that affects and how that works with carbon credits is something that is very complex and is very confusing. The more we study it, the more we're understanding that it does have the ability to maybe be adapted to our industry, specifically the beef cattle industry. But that's what we got to figure out, and how do we get that accomplished?
So Dean, there is a question here.
Mm-hmm.
The carbon footprint analyst and ESG sustainability assessment both sound valuable and important. What value do you have when paired together for an operation, or how do they work together?
Yeah, the most value, quite frankly, comes when you pair the two together, because it allows for really a complete analysis of both sides of the equation. What are we doing, from a carbon standpoint, but also what are we doing from, the ESG or environment and social and governance standpoint? So quite frankly, they are more valuable when they are together. One uses the other. The ESG will look at what the carbon index number is and uses that in its final report, if you will. So without question, they have value tagged on top of one another. Thank you for that. And I'll keep moving along on methane. Methane has really become the dairy industry and now somewhat the swine industry's gold. And especially when you look at it from a renewable fuel standpoint. Several years ago, California created a market for carbon, and they did this to help facilitate or reduce carbon emissions that were generated from facilities that sell fossil fuel and have a high carbon emissions rate. Basically, what it allows then is that somebody who is mitigating carbon emissions, such as a dairy facility, who in turn puts in a digester, that they would be able to mitigate or offset the same value, if you will, of carbon that was being emitted or carbon equivalents that were being emitted at that point in time. And so it gets confusing from that standpoint, but when you get right down to it, it's really it's cap and trade, if you will, and it gives you the ability to offset what you're doing through a purchase. So you can buy your way out of debt, if you will, when it comes to carbon emissions. What we've learned in the dairy business, and we'll talk about methane digestion specifically more, but to get to the root of it, what we've learned there is that we can take a dairy that has maybe a CI score of somewhere in the neighborhood of a plus 50 or 100, and putting in a digester, you will have a dairy that has a negative score of 150 to 200 or more. And so you can dramatically turn that around because essentially what you're doing is you're pulling out carbon that was, and in this case, methane that was going into the atmosphere, and you're basically regenerating that and selling it as a renewable natural resource. So that process allows you to essentially offset what was happening, and that offset is being able to be purchased, if you will, by someone who is still selling fossil fuel and hasn't created such an offset. Good examples of that would be Exxon or GE or whoever. Anybody that's selling energy or fossil fuel that is a derivative of mostly fossil fuels from the standpoint of because they have such a high carbon output when they're burned. It creates a very strong market, and watching that market over the past year, it fluctuates somewhat, but continues to get stronger every year. We'll get more into that as we proceed. The California credit is something that is really been done to what they are thinking is fighting climate change. Whether we believe in climate change or not is kind of irrelevant to the discussion. I have my disbeliefs about it as like everybody else does, but it's kind of irrelevant to the discussion because we know it has created an exchange that can be monetized and can be benefited by, the livestock industry. The credit is really from a state government program that requires power plants and other large industries that emit those gases to buy a credit as they are generating those problems. And that facilitates and mitigates the carbon emission process on auctions, all managed by what we call the California Air Resource Board. So it's essentially a buy-sell mechanism that anybody that emits it can buy it, anybody that's capturing it can sell it, and it creates a stable market. Washington and Oregon have adopted similar programs, although be it they are not as strong financially, but they are very similar in terms of how they're made up. Anytime that we have manure from any type of livestock, we know that there's a release of methane into the atmosphere once it's expelled. And that methane gas, if it's captured, really is what it boils down to. We push that into any type of capturing system, and it creates a process of anaerobic digestion. Anaerobic digestion is lack of oxygen. So when we take away the oxygen and we let something sit, it goes into an anaerobic state. And that digestion breaks down differently than aerobic digestion. Anaerobic digestion helps us create methane out of that product. Those microbes are breaking down the manure. The fatty acids at that point are further broken down by other bacteria that are occurring in there. And then at some point, those acids are converted over to methane gas and carbon dioxide. that methane gas and carbon dioxide floats to the top of the manure, and it can be harvested at that point in time. The one thing duly noted is that biogas or methane and carbon dioxide cannot be used because it needs to be cleaned. And so the next step really involves, how do we clean that? We have to scrub that product, remove the hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxides out of the gas to make sure that it's a usable form. Once it's scrubbed and then we have a pure product, we have renewable natural gas, and that has a tremendous value. Oops. The methane really really boils down to one thing that we've learned, and we've learned it from the dairy industry, is that they've been doing a really good job of this in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, especially because they've been able to monetize this process. About 20 years ago, methane digestion came into dairy farms, mostly from Europe, and they were all being put together basically to form methane gas that they would burn themselves in some type of a cogen or generator system. That generator would then at that point in time create electricity, and they were either using that electricity, or in this case, they were selling that electricity back to the grid. Neither one of them were sustainable because they weren't subsidized. Anytime that they were subsidized, they became sustainable, and that sustainability stopped after the subsidization quit. So it didn't cash flow all that well, and it was problematic. That changed when there was all of a sudden a value through the California Credit Exchange that basically created a much higher value for the capture of that particular product, and then taking that product and injecting it back into the pipeline. And so it really boils down to, what has dairy farmer learned? A lot, in terms of that. If you treat this product right, harvest it right, put it back into the grid, you can make a lot of money on creating methane. And really, a methane digester is simply is a tank or a covered lagoon that contains and it cooks that product, that manure, and then it captures those gases as they emit off the top. And if we do that, we're capturing it, and at that point in time can harvest it. Here's an example of tank digestion systems. So this would be a tank digester on a dairy, and essentially that product is very simply put. It's injected into the tank. There's usually a heater involved. We get that product up to 100 to 120 degrees, and you can cook that product for a period of 20 to 40 days, just depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And then all of that gas gets cooked off the top and basically gets loaded off the top and goes to a scrubber. And at that point in time, you've harvested your biogas, if you will. The effluent goes out of the other end. And again, there's a detention time in this particular unit of about 20 to 45 days typically. And it depends on how the system is designed. So it essentially has to be sized in order to be able to hold that amount of manure for those period of days that you're trying to harvest that biogas off of it. When we look at covered lagoon systems, they're a little simpler and quite honestly cheaper to build and maintain, but they don't harvest as much gas. So there's a trade-off in that respect. Covered lagoon is really very simple. You got cell 1 and cell 2. Cell 1 is where all of your fresh manure goes into, and then at that point in time has a retention time of usually a little bit longer. And you, of course, collect your biogas off of that, just like you would of the other one. And that cover allows you to harvest that product. And then, of course, it goes, the digestate goes into cell number 2, and that becomes a product that essentially turns into a manure that has a lot less odor to it, because you've cooked out most of the organics and odor-causing components, and really doesn't change a whole lot in terms of nutrient composition. So the product going through a digester, nutrient content doesn't change much, essentially. It does get less odorous. So there's some nice benefits to those two things as we go through that digestion process. Let's look at that now, what that means in terms of a total picture. If we look, for example, your cow, your pig, or whatever the case may be, excretes the product, it goes into a collection device. The sooner we get that manure into a digester, the more valuable it is. Every day it sits there, you're losing value. And so we need to get that product in there very, very quickly. And then it goes into 1 or 2 or how many ever digesters are needed on that facility. And then at that point in time, that product, the methane gas, goes off the top into a methane handling system and storage, and at that point in time gets scrubbed and cleaned and can be injected back into the grid, or it could go to a cogen system that's actually burning that methane to produce electricity. There are not many of those facilities around anymore, again, because what we mentioned, they simply don't cash flow all that well. Most of this product today that is actually cash flowing is products that are being scrubbed and injected back into the grid and being sold as renewable natural gas. The product that comes out of the bottom end of a digester, if you will, is essentially the manure. That can be separated or it can be sent out as whole. It really doesn't matter. Bottom line is it does maintain a large majority of its nutrient content. So that part is a benefit and really doesn't hurt anything. So that kind of gives you an idea of a typical flow of manure and how those things work through that part of the system. Again, the two options really are selling RNG, renewable natural gas, back into the pipeline, or using it to power a generator, make electricity. Not many of the second or option B systems are still in place today. So when we try to summarize what's this mean in terms of methane, it actually is a huge opportunity for the livestock industry, and we'll break that out by species here in a minute. That a digester obviously allows and just accelerates the breakdown in a controlled environment of that manure product. We harvest that gas, we clean it, we inject it into a pipeline, we sell that to gas companies, and then at the same time, once that's accomplished, you can sell the carbon credit that's associated with that RNG into those compliance markets that we mentioned. At that point in time, you've got a source of revenue, not only from the gas you're creating, but from the credit that you get for creating that gas. And it gets more complex at that point, but the monetary value is huge. And we'll give you an example of what that means here shortly. I want to break out the species side of this equation because this is the one where the challenge for the beef industry comes into play. Dairy and swine facilities have huge advantages when it comes to creating a digestive stream that makes sense for that type of a process. Our waste flow stream and the daily volume is constant. The organic content is consistent, and those things are very important for a digester. A digester is very, very similar to a ruminant gut in that if you feed it the same time every day, it stays happy, and the same thing every day, it stays happy. And so the digester is no different. It's basically a gut or a living organism. And if we feed that beast constantly, we essentially are able to keep it digesting and creating a very consistent supply of natural gas. And why is that? Because dairy and swine facilities are confined and they always have a manure collection system and storage practices that are easy to harvest. If we look at shallow pull plug pits in the swine industry, extremely easy to harvest that product on a regular basis because the product is flushed and can be flushed right to a digester. If we look at dairies, usually those systems are scrape lanes, flush lanes, or collected with a vac truck, but done on a daily basis. And so again, the sooner we get that product to the digester, the more value it has to the digester and to the process. So they're great candidates for those types of things. Remember that because that's the huge advantage right now. And then when we look at feedlots, what our disadvantages are. Right now, we have several problems because we know that the California Air Board doesn't recognize beef cattle like it should. It basically is looked at and said, you know what, we think dairies are great for this, and they're obviously able to produce methane, so wonderful. Same thing on swine, but not so much on beef cattle for several reasons. Most beef cattle are in open lots, and they know an open lot is very, very challenging to collect methane off of, so they didn't waste their time on trying to quantify those values that should be associated with it. We do need to figure out how to research that and how we can create legislative and regulatory changes with those boards. But the problem is when you look at an open lot, we do not have a consistent volume or organic content. We are very inconsistent on both of those because of the nature of an open lot. Most of our product is laying on the surface of the feedlot floor. It's an aerobic condition, and at that point, really doesn't generate a lot of problems, or I should say a lot of opportunities for us with respect to methane recapture. That product, again, is going to be mixed with the soil. Sometimes it's harvested once a month, sometimes it's harvested once a year. And none of those things lead to really good product that a digester can utilize. So we need to figure out what that really means. If we can get it quicker and we could get it cleaner, then maybe there's an opportunity for us to take advantage of those types of things. One thing that we're working on right now is exactly that. How do we try to get the California board to recognize deep pit manure and create eligibility for that product? How do we also then get research put together that would allow us to harvest manure from an open lot in a more judicious manner, and at the same time take that product and bring it to a digester? We need to think completely out of the box on this and how we look at raising cattle and how we can pull those things off. We need to take note from the dairy industry because they've been able to do it in a lot of situations much better than we have because of the way they manage their livestock. I'm not sure it's doable on a large scale like we have in the beef cattle industry, but if we don't try, we certainly won't get there. But I do think there are huge opportunities for us to figure out how to separate product from the soil and open lots. And at that point in time, create a product that, one, costs a lot less to transport and haul as a manure resource, but number two, could be eligible for possibly a digester and what would give us the ability to monetize those types of things. So it's a big discussion that we won't get into, but certainly one that's on the top of our minds. And bottom line is we're going to figure out a way to make those things happen, but it's going to take time, effort, and energy to pull that off. When we try to look at monetizing this whole program, we know, for example, we can sell carbon credits for our cropland today at a fairly decent rate, and I think that number will continue to get better as carbon credit values continue to grow. We know that grasslands can have a fairly decent value, and in some cases a higher value than that. The problem is there's not really an established market yet. Usually those markets are associated with larger projects that companies are taking on and to try to create a sustainability effort, and they've put that into part of their program, and is not so much a regulatory exchange, but a requirement of what they're trying to do from a sustainability measure. We also know that timber can be sold for a similar value, and sometimes those numbers are determined by tree species density and things of that nature. So today, if you have cropland, yes, you can sell those credits and make money. Grassland can be in certain situations, but it's a little bit more unique. I don't see that being that way for long. I think that'll change rather rapidly. And of course, timber, we just talked about, has some value as well. Here's where it gets really interesting. When we trying to figure out how do we monetize these types of things, here's what the dairy industry has done, and here's where, quite frankly, we got to figure out how to get to in the beef industry. Let's just take an example of a 5,200 milking cow dairy. And again, this dairy can be in California, it can be in Nebraska, it can be in New York City. It doesn't matter. Anywhere in the United States that you're doing these processes of digestion is eligible for exchange on the California market. So it does not matter where you're located. And we can get more into those details later with Q&A if you'd like. But we're going to take an example of 5,200 cow dairy. And the dairy owner in this case opted for 20% ownership of the digester. A lot of these digester companies will allow some ownership or even up to half ownership. And usually that's where the dairy capitalizes the best. And you'll see why here in just a minute. Essentially a covered lagoon system for this particular dairy, and all of the gas collection equipment and the gas scrubbing equipment and the injection port back into a grid pipeline is going to cost roughly about $10 million. So we'd ask ourselves at first, holy cow, that's a lot. If we compare that to what's going on in a tank digester system that, again, is more efficient in recovering gas, but it's got a cost of probably $40 million for this exact same facility. Oddly enough, both have a very similar rate of return. So it just it boils down to what kind of risk we're willing to take. The internal rate of return on this project is projected right now at 22%. There are 6 of them that are running right now that are actually doing better than that. So their projection is actually fairly conservative. The annual payment to the dairy in this case, they're going to get paid for the manure. The digester company will come in and pay you for that manure, and they're paying them $161 per cow per year, or in this case, $842,000 a year. They're getting a check for that manure, whether that company is producing methane or not. It doesn't matter. They've guaranteed them that amount for the ability to put a digester on their facility. Then the second part is, remember, they decided to opt for the 20% ownership. They're getting an equity payment of about $442,000 to go along with that. So at that point in time, between the two, the total annual payments back to the dairy are about $1.2 million. And the cool part about it is the dairy has no commitment to operational expense on that. That is all taken out of the profits before they get their payment, or after they get their payment. So in this case, it's something that starts to help people understand that the dairy business has got a huge advantage over the beef business because of this right here. At the same time, there are probably 20 different companies, 25 different companies running around the United States on trying to figure out how do they sign up dairies to become part of their program and create digestate and be able to sell gas to the system. So it's really fun to watch, but it's very interesting and quite honestly has a very strong monetary value that we didn't realize was going to be there. A couple of things to really think about as we look at carbon prices. The amount of carbon that is sequestered is not the only factor in price. The quality of the credit determines value. This is much more complex than we're going to get into tonight, but it really depends on how that credit is achieved and what was your baseline, what are your emissions after you put those practices in, and really the premium is paid on the difference between the two. And that's why a dairy in this case that was not digesting product, letting all of their methane escape into the air, is so dramatically different than one that gathers all that methane and takes it. So really you're paid for the value of changing practices, reducing emissions more so than anything. And they really don't pay you at that point in time for something you've always done, if you will. It gives you kind of a rough idea of what is going on in those industries and how those opportunities can be monetized, because we know if they can, they quite frankly will be something that we're able to make sustainable in our facilities. A couple of things that we're working on right now to help those things, again, is research on the open lot and deep pit manure challenges that we talked about. That's one that's near and dear to our heart, and we're going to figure out a way to make those things happen for the industry one way or the other. But we have got a lot of work to do. That is not going to be an easy challenge, and every time we think we're gaining something, we find out we're getting hit in the head with another stumbling block. And so we'll continue to work to make those things happen. Somehow or another, we need to reestablish the beef cattle side of the equation as stakeholders in this value chain and create more long-term value. Of course, conducting those footprints and ESG analysis have value in and of themselves. And I think that as we move down the road, that's going to have more value to our supply chain and where we're actually sending our product. And we've given you examples of that we talked about. With that in mind, I think we are near the end. And I've been rambling on here for a while, and I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions or anything that comes up, Benita, and I'll let you let me know if there are.
We do have a question. What is your typical head capacity on these dairies that these companies are targeting?
Typical is going to be about 4,000 to 5,000 head or more. When it gets to be less than that, they start to have a problem with the capital expenditures and the operating expenditures eating up the profit. And so that seems to be a breaking point of 4,000 to 5,000 head of dairy cows. And to elaborate on that, the equivalent in beef cattle would be about double that. And so if we had 10,000 head of beef cattle contributing to a system, 8 to 10,000, we would have about the equivalent of a 4 to 5,000 cow dairy, just based on the amount of manure produced.
Just a reminder, if you do have a question, go ahead and type it in the Q&A box. We've got a few coming in. If you want to ask your question live, go ahead and just raise your hand. Next question, how could this all work together with environmental compliance in Nebraska, especially if a producer currently works with Esg for compliance?
One of the things that we're working on is trying to figure out how we take the environmental assessment and the carbon footprinting and include that in our compliance program package, if you will. And so our goal long-term is to accomplish that. The neat thing about conducting a carbon footprint is that once you do the first one, the second and third and fourth ones every year after that get to be a lot easier because the process is in place, the data gathering systems are in place. So we hope to be able to bring that back to a very similar system the way we use our compliance program today. So that's a great question.
What is being mentioned for potential income to grassland owners?
Quite frankly, not enough. I think that opportunity still exists. One of the problems that we have is that so many of these markets are based on what we talked about a minute ago, and it's about the change that's created or the avoidance that you've created by changing a practice. And so if you were really bad and now you're really good in emissions, then at that point in time, you're going to get paid very well for it. If you've always been very good, quite frankly, you're not going to get paid near as much for it. And that's the problem with grassland. If you plant something to grassland that was tilled, it's probably going to be worth a lot of money. If you've always had grassland and it's there today, it's always been sequestering carbon constantly, it doesn't have near the value, unfortunately. And so we need to figure out as an industry, how do we do a better job of monetizing that portion of it, because it's a trouble spot.
Do you see a change in the future for dairies under 4,000 for technology in this?
Most definitely. Yeah, most definitely. We're working with quite a few different developing companies that are putting together digester packages for facilities. And what we've learned is that they all have a different number when you say, hey, what's the minimum head count you'll look at? So that tells me that there's probably a scalability that's involved here. And we're moving forward with 2 of our first projects that we'll actually be building digesters next year. So we're going to learn a lot more about this as we move this forward. And one of my goals is to figure out how do we make it more feasible for small scale operations. I think the key thing there is where do we take that product and how do we get it injected back into a pipeline? Because that's a huge expense. And of the $10 million CapEx cost for a dairy, 1 to 2 million of it can be just getting that product injected back into a gas line. So if we could minimize that number alone, it would give us some huge opportunities for smaller scale operations.
So talking about digesters, where could we observe a digester system in operation?
In Nebraska, it's going to be rather tough to find a whole lot that are actually functional. Danny Cluthy up in Howells, Nebraska has put one on his swine facility about 15, 20 years ago, small scale, and he creates his own renewable natural gas. And so he's actually doing it on a day-to-day basis and continues to. On a large scale basis, there are projects that are being built right now in Colorado, Texas, Minnesota, Iowa, and then in California, quite frankly, there's 100 of them that are up and running. And we had the opportunity to go to California a couple of weeks ago, and we toured 6 of them that were up and running. And it was amazingly simple, but yet at the same time, very complex on how detailed it was to get that gas cleaned and injected back into a pipeline. That's where the big expense comes in.
So how would this all work for a farmer feeder with a combination of row crops and potential a digester on the feed yard as well? And then maybe using the influence on nutrients on fields. How does the math and carbon accounting work for these credits?
Yeah, that's really the $1 million question that we got to get an answer to. And we know that we can monetize your farm ground to a fairly low rate, but a rate of, 10, 15 bucks an acre, maybe a little better in certain cases. We know that the feedlot side of it is going to be very tough to accomplish today with the way that the standards in California are written and with the way that we are able to harvest manure out of that particular facility. So it becomes a trouble spot that we've got to figure out. I think we'll get there, but it's going to take a few years to figure out how to get that part accomplished because of the way we harvest our manure and the way that the operation is historically ran in that scenario.
Do you foresee a byproduct from airplane fuel similar to distillers grains? And will there be similar enzymes used to break that corn down?
I don't know about the enzymes, but I do know that, yes, we will have a product that comes out of those plants that is almost identical to distillers that we see today out of ethanol. And one of their goals is to produce exactly that, basically a feedstuff that really has a carbon neutral number to it. So that part will be forthcoming.
Do we have any other questions for Dean? Dean, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us tonight to help us understand this complex issue. You put it in some terms that maybe we all can understand just a little bit better and how we can all work together to become environmentally friendly here.
Very good. Well, we appreciate that opportunity, Benita, and we're learning just a mountain of information every day on this right now as we dive into these issues and trying to figure out how we can apply it to these industries. And it's fascinating, and we know there's opportunity. We just got to go out and grab it.
Just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I know the Nebraska Cattlemen staff, we are working on some articles and some more information on this. So do watch our social media and our upcoming magazine for some more information. And you can certainly reach out to Dean if you have any questions. His phone number is there and you can contact him through the website. So do want to thank everybody for coming and joining us tonight. We will see you soon.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time.